Good morning. Today is the 23rd of April 2020, which means it's St George's Day. It also means it's the 102nd anniversary of the Zeebrugge raid carried out in 1918 on the coast of Belgium, attacking Zeebrugge and Ostend. It also means, because it's 2020, that we are all in lockdown. So I thought, given that there's not a huge amount else to do and because people might fancy having something to watch, I would re-record a paper I gave 2 years ago at a National Museum of the Royal Navy conference on the Zeebrugge raid, entitled Coastal Motorboats, Small Boats in a Big Raid. It's about 30 minutes long, so if you have an interest in coastal forces or motor torpedo boats or the Zeebrugge raid, please do enjoy it. It's not as if you've got anything else to do.
So, late at night on the 11th of April 1918, the various forces that would take part in Operation ZO, the attempt to blockade the ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge, sailed from their respective ports on the south coast of England. They were approaching the enemy-held coast when the operation was cancelled and all of the forces were ordered to withdraw. But that message unfortunately didn't get to one element of the force that had just sailed from Dunkirk on its way to carry out operations off Ostend. This small force consisted of 4 40-foot coastal motorboats, accompanied by 2 of the slightly larger 55-foot boats, and a number of 80-foot motor launches. Their mission was to prepare the way for the block ships at Ostend. CMB 20 would mark the Stroom and Bell buoys with bright calcium light floats, whilst CMB 33 went in closer to mark the 2 piers in the same way. The 40-foot boats would lay a smokescreen, whilst the motor launches laid a thicker smokescreen further out to sea. Having not received the message, they carried out these tasks and at 3 p.m. returned to base. Having not received the message cancelling this operation, they carried out their tasks and then at 3 a.m. returned to base. Unfortunately, one of the boats was missing. Coastal Motorboat 33 was spotted by the German defenders at Ostend and shelled, with 6 of the crew being killed. Even worse than the loss of the coastal motorboat itself was the fact that the lieutenant in command of the boat had, entirely against orders, taken a set of the secret orders with him on the raid, and these then fell into German hands. So not only had this coastal motorboat, still a fairly secretive weapon even in 1918, fallen into German hands, but the entire raid was jeopardized before it had even taken place. But what were these coastal motorboats, and what exactly were they doing off Zeebrugge and Ostend in April 1918? Well, they were very essentially the sort of speedboats of their day. And although we see this sort of boat almost everywhere now on lakes and out at sea as a form of pleasure craft, just like the aeroplane, they had only just begun to evolve before the First World War. Up in the top right, you can see Charles Mead Ramus, who was the rector of Playden and East Guildford near Rye in Sussex. And in 1872, he had proposed what he described as a polysphenic ship, which, by means of proposed inclined planes, would become the speediest in the world. His models his designs were largely based on models which were fired around by fireworks across lakes. But his concept of a stepped hull on a flat plane was sound. The idea being that through very fast propulsion, this vessel would lift out of the water and skim on the 2 points that were contacting with the surface, here in blue, which would allow it to remain stable. If there was only a single point of contact with the water, it would be incredibly unstable, but this method allowed there to be 2 points of contact. It would literally skim across the surface of the water. There was a problem with this, though. Experimenting with fireworks was all very well, but at the time there wasn't any sort of power plant that was sufficiently powerful and light enough to propel a boat like this. And it wasn't until 1876 when gentlemen like Nicholas Otto, the German, developed the 4-cycle engine, a very early internal combustion engine, and then other people such as Carl Benz invented the two-stroke internal combustion engine, which powered his Velo in 1894, the first production automobile. That power plants that were sufficiently powerful and light enough started to become available to power these new hydroplaning boats. And very soon, genuine speedboats, as we perceive them today, started to become a reality. Now, the idea of using the stepped hull was developed by many entrepreneurs and boat builders. William Henry Fowler patented this particular design in 1910 to include multiple steps as a means of increasing stability, whilst at the same time allowing the boat to lift clear of the water. But back in England, it was Sir John Isaac Thornycroft who patented the idea of a stepped hull in 1877, working at his shipyard in Chiswick. And his idea was for a much sharper bow, a more traditional boat bow, with a step and a very flat-bottomed stern to the boat as a means of fast propulsion across the water. And it's this stepped hull that we still see today. And going back to this photograph, you can see the sawtooth design of the steps on the underside of this fast motorboat. Thornycroft then developed a whole series of racing boats, the most well-known being his Miranda series, and this is Miranda number 4 at Monaco in 1910. But very much at the time, these boats were only being perceived for a sports use. There wasn't any military potential being seen for them yet, and that was especially true in the Royal Navy, who at the time, in the early 1900s, was still very much of the big gun philosophy. And they were looking at ways to increase the size of their warships and increase the size of their armament, which of course culminated in the launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906. And by the dawn of the First World War, the super dreadnoughts such as HMS Barham launched in 1914. The war didn't evolve in the way that it was initially expected, especially at sea, and the evolution of the motorboat in military service really fell to 3 junior officers, seen here, Lieutenants Hampden, Anson and Bremner, who were very aware of the risk being posed by the German high seas fleet coming across the English Channel and raiding the English coast, and particularly after the Scarborough and Hartlepool raids in December 1914, they put forward their suggestion to attack the enemy at its source. They conceived that you could use small, shallow draft boats that could skim over mudflats and minefields to attack German warships at their anchorage in the Schillig Roads on the northwest coast of Germany. The Admiralty were impressed by this idea and saw the potential merits of it, and so they were put in touch, or the 3 young officers were put in touch with Sir John Isaac Thornycroft, who developed this idea largely off of his own original design for Miranda 4. And he created a brand new type of warship, the fast motorboat. Initially, it was codenamed the Vedette Skimmer to try and disguise its true purpose, but it was literally a very early motor torpedo boat. It was built almost entirely in wood, an elm keel with an oak stem and very lightweight stringers to give it a very flexible frame, almost like an aircraft fuselage rather than a traditional boat design. This was then finished off with mahogany carvel planking. The step was built into the lower part of the hull on the underside and then filled with cork to give it extra buoyancy. And what this created was a small 40-foot boat displacing only 5 tons. But in order to achieve this level of technological excellence, the boat could only carry so much weight. It wasn't possible to fit complicated torpedo launching apparatus to it, and the engine as well had to be incredibly simplistic. And this video shows you the torpedo being fitted into the trough of the coastal motorboat. You can see that it's at the back of the boat and the torpedo is facing forwards. There was no option to fit complicated torpedo launching gear to a boat like this. The only way it was deemed possible to carry torpedo armament was to fit it in a trough at the stern of the boat. This meant it had to be launched from the stern of the boat as the boat was racing towards its target. which is a fairly risky business. As you can see from this video, even though the coastal motorboat pulls away from the torpedo initially, that torpedo porpoises in the background. It should dive to a depth that would pass under the coastal motorboat, but you could never really take that risk, and you see the skipper of this boat has turned away very quickly so that he is no longer in the path of the torpedo. Of course, if you're attacking an enemy target, you'll need to turn away from your target after you've fired at it anyway, so this wasn't too much of a problem. And by keeping the weight of the boat incredibly light, it was possible to design a very fast motor torpedo boat, capable of up to 35 knots. They could only go forwards though. The engine itself had to be kept lightweight, and so there was no space, no weight option for a gearbox, and so these boats could only go forward. There was no opportunity for them to be able to reverse. Initially, it was hoped that they might be able to establish a dedicated coastal motorboat base up at Ossie Island on the East Anglian coast, but instead the Admiralty decided to send the coastal motorboats to Queensborough, where they could start using them in operations against the Dutch and Belgian coasts. Although a number of plans were drawn up for raids on the Scilly roads, which would essentially involve sending a larger Royal Navy fleet, with the coastal motorboats carried in the davits of larger cruisers and then being dispatched to carry out their raid from not far offshore. But one of the problems of this was that although these boats had been designed and built, nobody really knew how best to use them. And the plans for the initial coastal motorboat operation, Operation MB, show how basic the idea was of using these boats. There wasn't really any serious consideration given as to how best to employ them, and literally these are the only orders that refer to how the coastal motorboats should make their attack. The coastal motorboats will be hoisted out and started on their venture, the total distance being about 42 miles. It is proposed that they make their attack 1 hour before sunrise, i.e. about 4:15 in the morning. Having made their attack, the coastal motorboat should, if possible, return to position Y, where they should arrive at about 5:30 in the morning, and there they will be met by the light cruisers. So it's clear that there's not actually any serious consideration as to how they should carry out their attack or what their strategy should be when they are on their own close to the coast. It's also realised that they might not come back. They should, if possible, return to position Y. And this is one of the reasons why within the coastal motorboat flotillas sometimes they refer to themselves as the Suicide Club. Even Jellicoe saw these plans, and he made no comment on how best the CMBs should be employed, literally just observing that the rest of the plan seemed sound. And in fact, it wasn't until after the First World War that a detailed 11-page document of tactical usage and these drawings was produced in 1920 on how best to employ CMBs, both tactically and strategically, and how to make attacks on enemy warships, and the number of fleet exercises. The very first fleet exercises to use coastal motorboats, held in 1920 off Spithead, demonstrated how best to use them, but this was all far too late for the First World War. Operation MB was postponed as a result of other incidents happening in the North Sea at the time, not least the Battle of Jutland. And in late 1916, the plans were officially ditched. The CMBs were moved from Queensborough down to Dover, and then a small detachment of 4 was sent over to Dunkirk, where they experienced a rather difficult winter, where it was very difficult for these very shallow draft boats to put to sea. However, in 1917, on the night of the 7th of April, 4 boats from Dunkirk slipped up the coast, CMBs numbers 4, 5, 6 and 9, to Zeebrugge. Now, it had been observed that the Germans were in the habit of sending their Flanders flotilla destroyers out of Zeebrugge harbour in the event of an air raid, so that they could ride out this bombing raid whilst the Royal Naval Air Service bombed what would hopefully be an empty harbour. And taking this in mind, the Admiralty decided to dispatch the coastal motorboats to attack any ships that they saw outside the harbour during the raid. and very successfully they spotted the German destroyer G88. She was less than a year old, a 100-ton destroyer, and during the raid the CMBs were able to torpedo her and sink her. So the loss of a 100-ton vessel, thanks to the actions of 4 5-ton vessels, is a considerable gain. Towards the end of 1917, Thornycroft began building even larger boats of the coastal motorboat design, a 55-foot type, which was capable of carrying 2 torpedoes in its stern trough. And very soon these were being adapted for all manner of other uses. By the end of 1917, there were 13 40-foot boats in service and 6 55-foot boats, and they were being employed not just with torpedoes, but also they were capable of carrying sea mines, and they were used extensively to lay close minefields around the Belgian ports. And it's estimated that up to 3 Flanders flotilla U-boats may have been sunk by mines that were laid by coastal motorboats. It was, of course, fairly dangerous work, and CMBs were lost. CMB number 1 and number 9 went to look for downed aircrew in the North Sea in 1917, and CMB 1 was struck by a shell from a German vessel which destroyed her. They could also be useful in deploying smoke floats or deploying smoke clouds through their exhausts. And these were used extensively for coastal bombardments. And this video, although it shows a motor launch, gives you a very good idea as to how effective a smoke float or a smoke screen being laid by coastal motorboats could be. And 15 coastal motorboats were employed to make smoke at Zeebrugge in just this fashion. And so on the 22nd of April, on the night of the 22nd of April, when Operation ZO went ahead, 24 coastal motorboats were used, 18 55-foot boats and 6 40-foot boats, as I said, 15 of them laying smoke at various positions off the shore of Zeebrugge and Ostend. The idea being to screen the arrival of the main fleet of warships and block ships that was approaching Zeebrugge harbour, and to screen the operations of the other coastal motorboats. Some of those coastal motorboats were specially employed and fitted with Stokes mortars, a type of trench mortar which was positioned on the bow of the boat so that they could run in along the Zeebrugge mole and attack German positions on the mole whilst the Royal Marines and Royal Navy detachments stormed along the positions. 2 other coastal motorboats were dispatched into Zeebrugge harbour area inside the mole itself, their mission being to identify enemy warships and target them before the arrival of the main fleet. CMB number 7 was commanded by Lieutenant Blake, and he steered his boat inside the mole. He's left a very graphic account of exactly what happened when he arrived there. Enemy star shells northwest of the mole silhouetted an enemy destroyer, apparently secured to the mole just to the west of number 3 shed. I then proceeded to work up to 30 knots and fired a torpedo at a range of about 600 yards, point of aim amidships. Boat was then stopped to observe result. Observed hit in line with forebridge, and having observed torpedo, altered course to port so as to escape to eastward and make smoke as ordered. During this time I was heavily fired upon by machine guns on the mole and heavy batteries to eastward of Canal. What's remarkable about that is that having fired his torpedo at a target, despite enemy fire from machine guns and heavy batteries, he then stopped his boat in the middle of Zeebrugge harbour to observe the result of the torpedo. Accompanying him was CMB 5, and as they entered the harbour area, they observed an enemy destroyer and followed it as it headed off to the northeast. It poured heavy fire on them, but as they closed, Lieutenant Alfwaite in command reported that he observed his torpedo hitting this destroyer just below the forward searchlight, which afterwards, he says, went out and the destroyer's fire diminished. Now, in actuality, no destroyers were hit by torpedoes during the Zeebrugge raid, and the only destroyer that was present, well, was recorded as being present, V69, the one alongside the mole, apparently hit by CMB 7, was undamaged. So how can we reconcile these reports made by the officers with the actual facts as we know them 100 years later? Well, it's not really for me to judge the actions of these men, but instead I think what we can do is refer to another officer from coastal forces in the middle here, Peter Dickens, who commanded the 21st MTV flotilla during the Second World War. And in his memoirs, Night Action, he left a very frank account of the difficulties of correctly interpreting targets as you saw them in the middle of the night. And one of his passages is worth repeating. Whilst making an attack against an enemy ship, he noted that she lives in my mind to this day as a 2,000-ton merchantman with raised forecastle, well deck with the foremast, bridge, midship superstructure, and funnel, another well, and a mainmast and a poop. In other words, a very large, lengthy merchant ship. I guessed the range as 500 yards, but that was subjective and derived from the original fixed idea. If you know what you are looking at on a dark night, you can guess the range. Or, if you know the range, you can estimate the size of what you are looking at. But if you know neither and guess one wrongly, the other will be wrong too. It's very easy in incredibly dark night with smoke screens and enemy fire creating flashes and blinding light to completely misinterpret what you're looking at. And as Peter Dickens comments later on, you almost see what you want to see. And this is the danger of night action. In fact, what Peter Dickens had been attacking rather than the merchantman was a small enemy armed trawler. Nonetheless, the Zeebrugge raid went ahead and was, the level of success has been debated ever since. Block ships were sunk in the harbour, but they didn't close the canal completely. Over at Ostend, the situation was not as successful, and this is almost certainly a result of CMB 33's failure earlier in the month, because the Stroom bank buoy was moved and the bell buoy was removed entirely. And this meant that when the force of block ships came in to locate these buoys as they should have been in their original positions, they moved in the wrong place, and the block ships started to approach the enemy shore rather than the harbour itself. But perhaps the coastal motorboats were able to make up for this when, on the 9th of May, in the follow-up operation, Coastal Motorboat 25 very bravely led the Vindictive into the Ostend harbour in an attempt to block it. This, unfortunately, wasn't incredibly successful either, but it showed the tenacity of these small boats and their versatility in operations on enemy coasts of this kind. After Zeebrugge, the coastal motorboats were finally given their own base at Ossie Island off the East Anglian coast, and this was a well-equipped facility with cradle traversers and launching cradles, manned by more than 1,000 Navy personnel. This seemed to be the ideal facility from which to actually operate and practice and develop the coastal motorboat as an effective warship. A number of operations were launched against the Schillig roads. On the 30th of June 1918, coastal motorboats were deployed from the davits of larger warships, and they were successful in torpedoing one minesweeper. They carried out a second raid on the 8th of July, although with no success, and then on the 19th of July, with the loss of one CMB, they unfortunately achieved nothing. Then on the 1st of August 1918, in Operation CMB4, they carried out a raid in daylight, and during this raid they were attacked by an enemy Zeppelin. This was followed on the 11th of August 1918 by Operation CMB5. 6 CMBs again made an approach to the Schillig roads in daylight, but they had to abort their operation and steer to the Netherlands and neutral waters when they were attacked by German aircraft. These photographs were taken by those aircraft as they made their strafing attacks on the CMBs. And if anything, this showed the true threat to warships of all sizes, not just battleships, but even right down to the smallest coastal motorboats, the future threat of aircraft, which of course would become all the more obvious in the Second World War. After the hostilities had ended in November 1918, the coastal motorboats continued to be deployed in the Russian campaign, the Royal Navy's intervention in the Russian Civil War, and a number of coastal motorboats were deployed to the Caspian Sea to carry out operations supporting the White Russians. They had to be taken overland to Baku on the Caspian Sea, and many of them were carried by train. Another force accompanied the Royal Navy force that was deployed on the Dvina River, where they were used on operations, mainly landing small forces of men on the shores of this river up and down the entire length of it. In one incident, it's reported the coastal motorboat towed a monitor off of a mud bank on the river. It doesn't identify the monitor, unfortunately, but it's possible indeed that it was M33, the one that is now preserved in Portsmouth Historic Dockyard. But the most significant deployment of the coastal motorboats was in the Baltic Sea, where Lieutenant Augustus Agar was carrying agents across past Kronstadt and around St. Petersburg. And then one night on the 17th of June, although operating without orders, he decided to attack the Russian Bolshevik cruiser Oleg, which was bombarding positions at Gorka. And he left a written account of the raid, including this map to demonstrate exactly what he did. This is his chart of operations. And there's a very interesting little note down there where he says, stopped for 20 minutes between these points to fit a new charge after the torpedo misfired before they had a chance to operate it. And so they literally sat drifting in between the screen of destroyers that you can see surrounding the cruiser Oleg. Extremely risky maneuver. After they managed to fit the new charge, they then carried out their attack on the Oleg, successfully torpedoing it, and it sank very shortly after, incredibly with the loss of only 5 lives. Agar was able to return back to his small base in Finland. And this led to a realization in the higher command, particularly Admiral Cowan, in charge of the Royal Navy fleets in the Baltic, that the CMBs could be deployed for other uses as well. And on the 17th of August, using a far larger force of coastal motorboats, specially brought over from Britain, they launched their attack on Kronstadt harbour itself. 8 coastal motorboats crept along the harbour wall on auxiliary engines, and then opened up their throttles, and as many of them as possible tore into the harbour, working their way around in a roughly anti-clockwise direction to torpedo warships that they could find in there. Several torpedoes were fired, and at least 3 hits were made, not necessarily destroying the vessels, but certainly striking them, damaging them. Although, as they then exited the harbour, a number of the coastal motorboats were lost to the actions of a Bolshevik block ship, a destroyer that was guarding the entrance to the harbour. CMB 79, 62 and 24 were all lost, and 8 men were killed, 6 were taken prisoner until they were released in 1920. But the operation had been successful. The depot ship Pamiat Ozva, the battle cruisers Petropolovsk and Andrei Pervozony were all struck and damaged to varying degrees. And the Finnish General Mannerheim, who would later go on to be the president of Finland during the Second World War, observed that when England strikes, she strikes hard. The Bolshevik fleet had been largely incapacitated in the Baltic. At the same time, Thornycroft was building even larger CMBs. This was this 70-foot model, which was designed to be an effective mine layer capable of carrying much larger mines. But at the same time, the Royal Navy was deciding to give up on the coastal motorboat, and in 1921 they decided to sell off the vast majority of the ships. They commissioned no more, and the facilities at Ossie Island were closed. A few coastal motorboats were retained for trial exercises, and these were based down in Portsmouth, where this photo was taken, where they were used by the Royal Navy School of Mining and Torpedo Warfare for various experiments. But other nations had taken note of the coastal motorboat, and they were very interested in purchasing them between the wars, and Thornycroft continued to build the CMB design almost completely unchanged from its First World War origins. They sold boats to the Netherlands, France, Sweden, the United States, Greece, Yugoslavia, Siam, which is now Thailand, Japan, China, France, Finland, and the Philippines Navy acquired several which saw action at the outbreak of the Second World War. In Britain, the coastal motorboat by the time of the Second World War had largely been succeeded by the birth of the true motor torpedo boat, these vessels that were built by Vosper, as in this case, or the British Powerboat Company. And the Thornycroft CMB design appeared to have had its day. Nonetheless, the Royal Navy requisitioned a large number that was still being built for other navies, in particular the ones that had been ordered by the Philippines, and several experimental designs that Thornycroft had been developing, including this one, MTB 107, which is essentially a coastal motorboat in hull form, just with slightly different upperworks. The MTB 107 served throughout the early years of the war. In fact, she was the very last Royal Navy vessel to leave Dunkirk in June 1940. For 7 months in the Mediterranean, coastal motorboats made up the only form of motor torpedo boat force for the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, although the vast majority of them were lost during the evacuation from Crete. MTB 344, another Thornycroft CMB design, the hull again being almost completely identical to the First World War design, only the upper works being slightly different, was less successful as a motor torpedo boat, but very successful in its use for commando raids, and it was used by the small-scale raiding force as the main means for them to approach the enemy coast, in particular the Channel Islands and Normandy coast, to conduct commando raids because of its incredibly low profile and its high speed and almost silent auxiliary engine. And so after the wars, a large number of these coastal motorboats were still available. Many of them were sold off by the Admiralty. Some of them were developed into private motor yachts, such as this example. Some of them were more bizarrely turned into playthings for their owners, this one having another engine fitted to it, this time above water, as a means to propel it. And I'm reliably informed that although this should have boosted its speed quite considerably, the additional weight that it added to the boat meant that it gave it no speed advantage at all. A number of the boats ended up as homes, literally houseboats, such as this one, a 70-foot example, CMB 104, which was for many years a happy home in Shoreham Harbour, although it was broken up about 10 years ago. And so there aren't very many of these boats left today. There are but a handful of examples, such as CMB 9, which has been restored and is the only seagoing coastal motorboat currently around. 70-foot example, CMB 103, which actually saw service in the Second World War as well, and was part of Force J, the naval task force that took troops to Juno Beach. She is now preserved in Chatham Historic Dockyard. CMB number 4, which you can see in the background of this photograph, is the boat that was used by Lieutenant Augustus Agar to torpedo the Oleg in the Baltic in 1919, an action for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross. She is now on display in Boathouse 4 in Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, and she sits above the boat you can see in the foreground, which is a replica 40-foot coastal motorboat that is being built by Portsmouth Naval Base Property Trust and will be a fully seagoing design when she is completed. And finally, coastal motorboat 331, or more technically motor torpedo boat 331 as she was commissioned, a 55-foot coastal motorboat that saw service in the Royal Navy during the Second World War, originally being built for the Philippines Navy, requisitioned by the Royal Navy, and briefly saw service with them. She has been restored and will become the primary exhibit alongside MTB 71 in the Coastal Forces exhibition that is due to open in Gosport as an exhibition of the National Museum of the Royal Navy in 2021. That exhibition being called Spitfires of the Sea. So I hope that was of interest. If you have any questions, do feel free to message them to me either via my website or on Facebook or Twitter, and I'm more than happy to expand on some of these details. With this lockdown continuing, maybe I'll do some more talks like this in the future if people like them. Thank you very much.